All right, so as we begin to, well, I guess as we continue looking at the Old Testament, how it is that the Old Testament came about. Remember last week we talked about inspiration, and we broke the concept of inspiration down really according to the grouping of books. And those groupings, remember, according to the Jewish separation of scriptures, were what three groups? The law, the Tanakh, which is the Torah or the law, and then the next section is the prophets, and then the writings. All right, so the law, the prophets, the writings, and we demonstrated that inspiration kind of looks different. It's not as if there's a cookie-cutter way that God does inspiration. In some things, like Moses, he spoke with him face to face, told him to write things down. Some of the prophets, he sent a vision or something to them, telling them to write this down and deliver this message. But then we said the writings, do they work the same way? Like the Psalms. Is God dictating the Psalms? Saying, here, David, write down this psalm of contrition. No. And so inspiration looks different. And we have to allow for that fact. And that's going to play some more discussion once we get into the New Testament and asking about all of that. But I wanted to continue this evening by talking about the canon of the Old Testament. And when I say canon, what do I mean by canon? Yes, Kelly. Okay, the accepted group of scriptures, of writings. Yes, very good. Has nothing to do with military ballistics or anything such as that. This word canon is a word that means something like ruler, we would say. Standard of measure, a standard of measurement, something that you measure up against. And so I like the way that Kelly put it. The books that are in the canon are books that meet the standard of entrance. I think it's Bruce Metzger who said the canon is not an authoritative list of books. It's a list of authoritative books. Could you tell the difference in those statements? It's not that somebody put a stamp of approval and said, all right, I like these books, this is now the canon. It's, here's the canon, let's measure all the books up against it. And if they fit, we'll keep them. If they don't measure up against it, then they are rejected. This discussion, by the way, of the canon is a whole lot easier in the New Testament discussion. And we're going to find that to be the case, that we could have a really good discussion about it. But the problem is we just know less about how it is the canon of the Old Testament was put together. So again, I think if we focused on the traditional breakdown of the books again, you had the law, we said earlier, and then the prophets, and then the writings. By the way, I probably should have forewarned you in my introduction. I meant to. I'm going to be doing an awful lot of talking tonight. In this type of stuff, there's just not a whole lot of discussion points, and there's going to be a whole lot of information, and some of y'all are really going to enjoy that, and you're going to eat it up, and some of y'all might be bored out of your minds. I don't know. We'll see how this goes, but it's just the nature of the discussion and what we're trying to get to that we have to have these kinds of just highly informative types of discussions. So you have the law, the prophets, and the Psalms to help us kind of see where the canon kind of was put together. Because which is the earliest of all of these? the law, right? I mean, Moses is the very first one to have written anything down. And the very first thing that he writes down is what? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. All right, so we're going, the law contains the oldest information, and it's the oldest of the writings. And so this is something that is handed down to us that's the very oldest. As we talk about the law, we talked about this last week. There's a lot of internal evidence that suggests that Moses wrote the law. Did he write all of it? No. How do we know that? Okay. You mean like when somebody wrote that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth? I'm assuming Moses didn't write that in Numbers chapter 12. That's my guess, is that he didn't put down, now, hey, I just want to make this little note about myself here. What else, though, did Moses probably not write about? His death. He talks about, and Moses went up on the mountain, and Moses died. And somebody pinned that. Somebody added to this. Is that a problem, by the way, to say that Moses wrote the law? And to know that there are things that Moses didn't write? Is that an issue? It shouldn't be. That's okay. Somebody else took hold of it. And by the way, a name that is given for this, a name that I'll probably use from time to time, and I have no idea if I'm spelling it correctly, is a redactor. That's kind of the term that's used. Think of it as an editor. A redactor is someone who often goes in and takes stuff out. So I don't want to give that impression that that's what they're doing. It's just that's the term that's used a lot for the editors. Somebody somewhere down the road took these things that were written and did some editing to them. Added some bits of information, some qualifying terms. You have phrases throughout, not just in the law, but in what we'll call the former prophets, the books of history and things like that. A phrase that had a lot to do with our summer series last year. Anybody remember our summer series last year? You're like, we just got done with the summer series. That's way too many to remember, right? We had this phrase, to this day. Right? Remember this? And we talked about somebody, somewhere, down the road talked about events that happened right there and said, oh, and by the way, this is the way that it has been all the way to this day. Whatever that day is, we know it's not concurrent with the original events, right? Does that make sense? So, this helps us understand, there are editors. Now, as far as the canon is concerned, this is somewhat problematic if you don't accept the internal resources, the internal discussion, the things in the law and in the prophets and such that claim that that Moses wrote this. We don't have anything else. Unlike corresponding stuff for the New Testament canon that's all over the place, we don't have writings that were during these times, books that were written by other people that we can go to and we can read about and we can see, oh yeah, clearly this is corroborated. Oh yeah, clearly this was written at the same time that during the Omri-Ahab dynasty and with Elijah, and these are the writings that back up all of the stuff that took place. And those writings don't exist. We don't have stuff that is still extant from that time. That's why, really, in the 1800s, it was all the rage to challenge that Moses did not write the law. And by the way, that hasn't gone away. A lot of very, very, very smart people, even some who would call themselves Christians, many who claim Christianity, they say, yeah, but Moses obviously didn't. He didn't write the law itself. It was written by other people. And we're going to talk, if we have time. I saved that discussion to the end because I knew I would get bogged down in it, and I want to make sure that I hit other stuff. So if we have time at the end, we'll talk about that with a guy named Wellhausen. Anybody heard that name before? Y'all been reading up on your Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, JEDP theory? Any of you guys ever heard that before, JEDP? Okay, all right. Well, hopefully we'll have time to get to that and discuss that a little bit. All right. So again, I think there's plenty of internal evidence that helps us know this was in effect. However the law was put together, the law was there, and probably there in its current state, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law was already there and in place before later people talked about it and referred to the law. Does that make sense? So, there's at least enough for me, internal evidence, that I'm not going to just simply throw out. And yes, there clearly was some kind of editor. All right, let's talk about the prophets then. And in the Jewish scriptures, the prophets break down into what two categories? It's a good guess, but no, not major and minor. We actually break down the prophets in that way. Okay, literary, non-literary. He stole writing from Jan and then gave it a different, like, higher level name, right? So I'm with you. I'm backing you up, Jan. He was trying to steal your answer. So yeah, no. Yeah, literary, non-literary, writing, non-writing. Actually, no. No, it's really not. They would say all of them are writing prophets, but they break them up. They're very let's see, clever with the names. There are the former prophets, and there are the latter prophets. Those are the two categories of prophets. Former being what books? Nope. Isaiah wouldn't fall into that category. The former prophets start with what book? Nope. Follow the progression. Law, prophets, writings. What book? Joshua. Joshua is the first book of the former prophets. And so the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, the Samuel scroll, the King's scroll. Those would be called the former prophets. Notice I skipped one. What was that one? Ruth. Yep, the former prophets are ruthless. You don't get Ruth until you get down here to the writings. All right, so the latter prophets then begin with what? Kelly? Isaiah. And these are what we would call the writing prophets, or the major and minor prophets. These would be what they would call the latter prophets. And stylistically, what they're doing, these are going to be different, obviously, because we take the former prophets and we call those the books of history. To them, that's the writings of the prophets. Yeah, Dave? Yes. Did I not say Judges earlier? Okay. Yeah, I may have just skipped over because in my mind I was like, don't say Ruth, don't say Ruth, don't say Ruth. And then I may not have said Judges because I was thinking about not saying something else. So, but yeah, Joshua, Judges, and then Samuel, Kings would be. And remember, Samuel and Kings are one book. Well, I mean, each of those are just one book. They don't break them into 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. So there's going to be less books that they would have. So these are the former and the latter prophets. And one of the things that I think is important for us to notice, especially if you read through the former prophets, is there is a flow of continuity between all of these. If you look at the ending of one to the beginning of the next, it's almost like you're reading a continual story. And that even comes out of Deuteronomy. Out of Deuteronomy flowing into Joshua, you see the narrative is it's flowing perfectly. It's almost seamlessly. And between each of these, this is an indication that they're not just grabbing a bunch of random writings and slapping them together. There's definite flow of thought. There's a larger flow of thought that flows between all of these writings. And to me, that's indicative that somebody took all of these and helped flow the seams in a certain way. Helped make sure that as you read from one into the next, you saw these connections at the end and at the beginning. We talked about this at length, if you remember, going from the book of Judges into Samuel. Anybody remember one of those phrases at the end of Judges? Okay, there was a man from the hill country of Ephraim. That's what Sean just said. Y'all remember that phrase? I was wondering if I was going to have to go and, well, Joshua's not here tonight, is he? No, I was going to say if I needed to go find Joshua, bring him in here to tell us, but Sean remembered. So, good job, Sean. Yeah, there was a man from the hill country of Ephraim. It closes out Judges in the last two narratives, and then you see it again in the beginning of Samuel, right? That's indicative to me of purpose and thought. Somebody collected these things together and has put them together in such a way that they are one unit. Does that mean that that one individual wrote all of them? No. It doesn't have to. But that's the work of somebody who is redacting or editing, the work of a redactor or an editor, and it very well could be somebody was writing all of these. So, the latter prophets, typically I think we assume the scrolls and namesake wrote what is written, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, we know some clearly are not the case. So, generally speaking, though, we'll say, the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Jeremiah. And even though Jeremiah has a scribe, we still attribute all of that to him. All right, so the prophets span all the way from Joshua to what time period? The former and latter together. This takes us all the way through what time period? All right, all the way through the Persian, all the way through their return. Who's the very last of the prophets? Yeah, Malachi, who is alive probably during whose time? Historically? In the Bible, I mean, not... Who's at the end? This isn't supposed to be a trick question. What do we call the books of history? Who's at the end? You guys are going through your books of the Bible right now in your heads, aren't you? You're singing the song. Who's right before Job? Well, not right before Job, because that book's out of place a little bit, but... Okay, but Esther's a little out of place, though. So who's right before Esther? Yeah, Ezra, Nehemiah. These guys are concurrent around the same time of Malachi, probably the time the Chronicles are getting written, and probably the time that the compilation of the canon is being made. They're probably the ones during this time period of Ezra and Nehemiah now that we're getting to the very end of prophetic writings, the very end of the latter prophets, the very last ones who are there, there's, I think, a reason that we kind of abruptly end here during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're the ones putting the finishing touches. They're probably the ones who are adding editorial notes to the Psalms, or taking what's there and kind of helping them out. They're the ones who are probably taking the different books of Psalms that are out there and putting them together, as the case is. And so they're doing an awful lot. Many of the writings themselves are post-exilic. That is, they're after the exile. Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all of these are in the writings, and I think it's that way because they're on the other side of the exile, and they understand. The ones who are writing these and doing the compilations, they don't see themselves as prophets in the same way that they saw former writers of history as prophets. And so they put their writings here. Now, obviously, as we just mentioned, there are some prophets who make their way into, prophets who are post-exilic, who make their way in because they can clearly see they're prophets of Yahweh. By the way, what changed before and after the captivity? What's one of the biggest most dramatic changes after the captivity for Israel, the people of Israel? Okay, synagogues. Yes, that changed. I'm bigger picture than that. No idolatry. Idolatry's gone at this point. They don't go to Babylon and pull their gods with them and bring them back and say, well, I guess we're going to serve Babylonian gods now. Oh, the Persians took us over. Let's incorporate their gods. None of that is taking place. They've learned their lesson, and they become really hardcore about this whole monotheistic Yahweh worship, which is, I believe, what helps prompt putting together the canon as they put it together. So this is just my thoughts on this. But you do have a couple glaring differences. For one, I can't give you a good reason for this. Daniel is not included in the prophets. We include him in the prophets, but they don't. And the best reason I can give you is that Daniel was not part of the 12. When I say the 12, the minor prophets are a single scroll that has the 12 minor prophets, and they called them the 12. And Daniel was not one of those. So the minor prophets, because it bridged the gap from before to after, all of that, then they were given that kind of treatment. But they didn't maybe fully know what to do with Daniel because he really wasn't a before. He was fully part of the captivity. And so he's relegated in some way. Again, I don't have a good answer, but and then Ruth also is part of the writings. And that one, I think it's because they don't believe that Ruth was a writing from this time. It's very well could have been put together in the times back here, a story that has been a part of their tradition, and a part of whose tradition? Because really, Ruth ultimately is about whom? David. Yeah, the very last word of Ruth is David. Ruth is a David origin story. And we like to think of Ruth and Boaz and all of them on their own, but in their minds, this is a David origin story. This is where David came from, and so they probably include that there. All right, so all of this to say the canon of the Old Testament probably did not take its final form until the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Some believe that maybe it didn't take its final form until you get to the time of the Hasmoneans. Anybody familiar with that? The Hasmoneans, heard that? During what we call the intertestamental period, springs from the Maccabean revolt. You guys heard Maccabees? Heard that one? Yeah, so coming out of that and really setting things up from there, you had the Hasmonean dynasty and such during that time that some people believe they're responsible for putting together the canon in its final form that we have it. All right. Questions on any of that? I threw a ton of information at you, I know. I was trying to make sure you had enough information that you couldn't think of any questions that I wasn't able to answer. Dave thought of one anyway. Yeah, Dave. Mm-hmm. All right, could Ezra have been part of the redaction? I think he very well could have been. I would not say he was. I wouldn't go that far because, again, we just don't know. But given the time frame of when all of this went down during the Ezra and Nehemiah time frame, and Ezra's prominence, because he was the premier law guy of his day. I mean, that's very clear that he was what you see in later part of Ezra and in Nehemiah when he shows up. He's a guy that was kind of a big deal during his day. I could completely see him being a part of it. But that's just my internal theory on it. So, all right, very good. Anybody else have any questions? All right, but before we move straight to the New Testament, if we're talking about the Old Testament, the canon, what do we really need to talk about? Kelly? Why didn't some make the cut? Is that what you said? Like what? Oh, yes. Thank you, Kelly. That's exactly where I was wanting you to go. The question was vague enough. I was like, I don't know. Yeah, the intertestamental writings. What do we call those? The Apocrypha, right? Oh, boy. I have no idea if that's right or not. So you guys are going to have to check me on that one. Yeah, wait, I probably have it on here. Yes, that was right. Okay, so the apocryphal books, what are these? Yeah, Kelly? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I wasn't, when I said what are these, I didn't mean list them out. Honestly, I couldn't even list them out for you. I just, we don't study these, right? We don't spend our time with these. We probably should. It's a black hole that I should fill up. But yeah, Kelly talked about how the apocryphal books, they're in some Bibles, aren't they? Namely the Catholic Bible. So, let's discuss this. How is it that there are those, which, by the way, the Catholics would call them the, no, I have to look. I think it's deuterocanonical? Deuterocanonical, yeah. Deuterocanonical. You guys should come up here and try to write that out on a whiteboard sometime with people watching you. That's fun. Yeah, your blood pressure goes up when you're spelling things on a whiteboard, by the way, because that just happens. So this is the term that the Catholics would use. What's deuterocanonical? Okay, you see canon in there, right? What's Deuteronomy? All right, second Deuteronomy, nomos, law, second law. So deuterocanonical is second what? Second canon. So they see the apocryphal books, the Protestants would call them the apocryphal books, they would call them the second canon of books. And these, with the exception of some things like there's some additions to Daniel that's a part of this and some things like that, but generally speaking, these books are considered not to be a part of the Old Testament per se, but they are a second canon of books, bridging the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I prefer the term for these from, we sometimes would use the term intertestamental. Intertestamental books, you guys have heard that phrase before. I like myself Second Temple literature. That's an LI, not a U. All right, Second Temple literature. And we've talked about this before, what that means, during the time of the Second Temple before the first century. So let's talk about these. These are separate from the Old Testament. They're not necessarily meant to be a part of the Old Testament canon. They saw this as a second canon. And it's important to understand, everybody recognizes during this time period, there are no prophets. There's no prophetical writing. The people of that day don't claim to be prophets. It's just understood that these are, we call them years of silence. Well, that's what they are. And they understood that about themselves. They don't claim to be, giving God's inspired word as prophets during this time. The earliest Christians did not treat these the same way that they treated the canonical Old Testament. And so, they quote them a lot. The earliest Christians quote them a lot. The New Testament has quotes from these extra canonical books, right? Jude makes a reference. The Hebrews author does. I think Peter does. Paul does. They're in here. And so there are quotations to these. These are in the air. People know them. People understand them. They're a part of how they understand the Bible as a whole, but they're not treated the same. They're not given the same authority. When you get to the writings from the 2nd through, say, 5th centuries or so, what do we call those writers in the 2nd through 5th centuries? Yeah, these are the church fathers, or the apostolic fathers. So if you hear people talking about the church fathers, they're not talking about the apostles or people of the first century. The church fathers are the writers after the first century who are writing about things, and they do not treat these as inspired. They don't treat them as authoritative. In fact, there are some pretty big names, like, any of you guys heard the name Athanasius before? Origen, you probably heard that one. Origen. They were actually antagonistic to these extra writings because of the way that some might have used them. Perhaps the biggest opponent was a guy named Jerome. Anybody know who Jerome was? What he was responsible for? Yeah, he's the one who translated the text into Latin and created the Latin Vulgate. And so when he did that, Even though these were still a part of things, he was actually against these things. Yeah, Aaron?
Would this be would this little section be where the Council of Nicaea came in?
Yep. Yeah. The Council of Nicaea in AD 325 is during the Church Fathers. Yes. Now, the Council of Nicaea doesn't really have much to do with, the ideas of the canon, although there will be a later council that will ratify the full canon. And that's Old and New Testament together, but that doesn't come till after, and we'll save that discussion for when we talk about the New Testament. But yeah, exactly, Aaron. That's going to be during this time frame. During what's often referred to as the Middle Ages, the medieval period, there is never any canonical acceptance of these writings. Nobody, they're in all of the Bibles, but it's understood that these aren't the same thing as the other writings. Does that make sense? They're there, but they're not treated as treated in the same way that these writings are treated, and by this point, the New Testament writings are treated. These are treated differently. Now, when this really came into effect was during the Reformation in the 16th century, when the Protestants began to challenge these writings and say, why do we have these writings in our Bibles if they're not a part of the Masoretic text? Anybody know what the Masoretic text was? All right. It's on our docket to talk about. So, I have a feeling we're not going to be able to talk about everything I want to talk about tonight, but we'll talk about some of the stuff. But they would say that's a text of the Hebrew writings that was put together between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. And we'll talk about that when we talk about it, why that Masoretic text was so important. But they use that as the standard for their Old Testament. They say, none of this is in there. All it has is the Tanakh. So why are we continuing to add these things? But this is in the middle of a debate, right? A large, overarching debate between the Protestants and whom? Catholics, right? The Catholic Church, the Reformation, Protestants and the Catholic Church. And anytime you're in a debate, if your partner says, or if your antagonist, your opponent says one thing, what do you have to do? You have to say the opposite. Which is why, once the Protestants started challenging these things, what do you think the Catholic Church did at that point? They doubled down on it, which is the exact words I have in my outline right here. Way to go, Sean. Nailed it. Yeah, and the Council of Trent in 1546, which was the Catholic Church's big answer to the Protestant Reformation, that's where they said, whoa, no, these are really important to us. And we're going to double down on the fact that they should be in our Bibles. So, many Bibles included the apocryphal books, very early ones, but due to the expense of printing in its early days, and to save a few dollars, and the Protestants saying, they're not necessary, they began to just phase them out. They didn't say that you shouldn't have them in a Bible per se, but they were saying, why would you? Why do you need it? We don't refer to them as authoritative anyway. Therefore, they kind of stopped printing them in their Bibles. And that's the way that we eventually got to where we are today, where there's a very clear line of demarcation between the Bible of the Catholic Church and Protestant Bibles, which is predominantly what we use. Make sense? The whole discussion about the Apocrypha and these books, any questions on that? All right. Very briefly, let's talk about the Masoretic text. All right? Let's talk about the All right, for those of you who like to know how things are spelled, and I hope I spelled it correctly, let's talk about the Masoretic text. The Masoretes, they were kind of a sect of the Jews way down the line. Probably they came from what you would call the rabbinic schools, the Pharisee type of schools. Anyway, we're talking 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 centuries after Jesus. Okay, so we're way down the line. So maybe not. Maybe I went the wrong way with that. But 6, 7, 8, 9. That's what I probably should have said. Because they were kind of the last ones remaining who could look at the Hebrew Bible and who could read it. And by read it out loud, because they knew all of the sounds that were made, which is very difficult because in the Hebrew Bible, just like in English, there are a lot of words that are written exactly alike, but they have different sounds to them. And if you say them differently, it completely changes the meaning. Does that make sense? Yeah, and now you're getting to where it was no big deal because everybody did that for forever. But now you're getting down to where there's very few people who can still read the Hebrew Bible with all its inflections and sounds. The oral tradition is dying, and they say, we need to do something about this. So they took the Hebrew Bible that they had, and they created a system of what's called vowel points. That is a series of dots and dashes and things that they used to give sound to the words. And so as you read through the Hebrew Bible today, you'll actually read it with all these little squiggly things underneath and over top, sometimes right in the middle of all of the words. Those did not exist before the end of the first millennium. This is huge, what it is that they did. They preserved the understanding of the Hebrew text for later generations. Because I guarantee you, I'm not even saying I could pick up a Masoretic text and necessarily read it. There's no way I could do anything with what there was before. And that's the way it was for a lot of people. So that's what the Masoretes did. We owe so much to them for doing that. What's interesting is the Masoretic text is all that they had. Because during the Middle Ages and moving forward, they didn't have the old texts anymore. They're just gone. Nobody had any. The only thing that was there was the Masoretic text. And so that's why, they said, hey, when it's the Masoretic text, why are we doing all these things? Because the Masoretic text was the only Hebrew authority that they had. And that was the way it really was until the mid-1940s. What happened then? The Dead Sea Scrolls. The first time that people were opening up ancient Hebrew writing, like large sections, sometimes, a lot of it's small sections, but some were large scrolls of text that was the Hebrew text without what the Masoretes had given. And even though you're going to find variations on things from time to time, they were thoroughly surprised just how much of the Masoretic text actually matched up perfectly with what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even though the Dead Sea Scrolls, anybody know the dating of those? The dating actually expands a lot. But a lot of the ancient Hebrew scrolls are dated to around when? Anybody know? Yeah, around 200 BC. And so you've got like a century between the writing of the Masoretic text and these scrolls that verify, that says, yeah, they really weren't that far off with what they had, with what they found. So that was huge. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls was huge as well. All right, we are almost out of time. And just very briefly, I want to mention the documentary hypothesis. I may start with this next week because it is kind of a big deal still. And I want to make sure that we have an answer for it. But when people began to say we have rationalism, humanism, we have science, we don't need God, God is just there for the superstitious people to give them hope in hopeless times. Kant, I think, who said religion's an opiate for the masses, that type of an idea. They began to say, well, let's look at the writings. Obviously, the writings don't come from God because there is no God for them to have come from. So let's figure out who the real authors were. Surely it wasn't Moses who wrote the law. That couldn't have possibly been the case. So let's start digging into the law and let's find out who did. And, the old saying, if you want to find something, you're going to find it, right? They start digging in. They say, oh, here are signs everywhere that there were actually different people who wrote different sections of the law, and then somebody stitched them all together like Frankenstein's monster. And that's what we have. And they see multiple stories of women at wells, and they say, well, this is multiple copies of the same story. And then somebody just kind of put them in different places. But they say, but it was obviously the same story, right? It's just repeated in different places. So you have those types of things. Anyway, he developed his whole theory of 4 basic authors based on these things. The first one is the Jehovah, or Yahweh, the Jehovah author. That is the one who uses Jehovah as the name of God. Because God has more than one name in the law, right? So there's one author in the law who uses the name Jehovah. And so when you see the name Jehovah through there, you know it's this guy. What about the E? Who do you think that is? Elohim, right? Yeah, the guy, the Elohim. So when you see Elohim used instead of Jehovah, then you know it's a different author who wrote these sections. You see how this works? And so this guy wrote these. And then he said, then you've got Deuteronomy, which is its own weird thing going on out here. Obviously, there was an author for Deuteronomy who was focused about, who was all focused about trying to make the leaders in Israel look better. And so he wrote these things for them in the land so that at some point they could pull it out and say, oh, ha-ha, here's what God said. You guys are supposed to trust your leaders and things like that. And he said, and then there's also another author who's very clearly all about the tabernacle and the priesthood and holiness. And he says these are 4 distinct people, authors, or 4 different schools of authors. And they wrote their things, and someone came along and just took all of their writings and then just stitched them all together into one big mashup. That is the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP theory. So we may, if I remember, we may start with this next week. And then that way I'll be able to provide at least an answer for that. So, questions? If so, hold them for next week. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Good class.